By the time the Shidehara cabinet resigned, the practice of the general recommending the next prime minister to the Emperor of Japan had already collapsed. Therefore, the incumbent prime minister was required to recommend a successor. The person that Shidehara Kijiro recommended as the next prime minister was Ichiro Hatoyama, the president of the Japan Liberal Party, which became the largest party in the House of Representatives. Upon receiving this request, Hatoyama expressed his desire to form a cabinet and began preparations. Thus, Shidehara went on the Emperor of Japan's behalf and recommended Ichiro Hatoyama to be the next prime minister. However, shortly thereafter, a surprising order was issued by GHQ. It was an order purged from public office. GHQ had concerns about his participation in the Yokusen Seiji Kai before the war and his extremely nationalistic words and actions. This order prevented him from becoming prime minister. Following this purge from public office, he resigned as president of the Japan Liberal Party. The Japan Liberal Party was deeply shaken by the sudden loss of its president. They were forced to quickly find a successor. During the search for a successor, the name that came up was Shigeru Yoshida. He built his career as a diplomat, worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then became a politician. During the war, he distanced himself from the Tojo cabinet. After the war, he served as Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Shidehara cabinet and acted as negotiator between GHQ and the Japanese government. In order to overcome the chaos of the occupation, Yoshida, who has international credibility and negotiating skills, was considered to be the ideal person to serve as president. However, he said, "I am a diplomat and have no confidence as a politician." He initially refused the presidency. However, at this point in time, there was no one else in the Japan Liberal Party who was suitable to become its president. So he responded to the strong requests from those around him. He accepted the position of president of the Japan Liberal Party, subject to 3 conditions. The first condition was that we would not raise funds. The second condition was that no one had any say in cabinet appointments. The third condition was that he was free to quit whenever he felt uncomfortable. Thus, he became the new president of the Japan Liberal Party. However, at that time, Japan had lost territory after the war and the nation's overall wealth had declined significantly. Furthermore, many Japanese who were in overseas territories were gradually withdrawn to the mainland. This led to food shortages in the country and prices rose rapidly. To deal with this situation, governments began issuing more and more paper money. This resulted in the value of money decreasing and inflation escalating rapidly. Citizens were no longer able to buy food, and it was even predicted that if things continued as they were, 10 million people would starve to death. The food shortage had become so severe. Under these circumstances, people formed labor unions all over the country to protect their lives and jobs. Their fears for their livelihood soon turned to anger toward the government. On May 1st, the first post-war May Day Central Conference was held. This May Day, approximately 500,000 people gathered in front of the Imperial Palace, opposed the reactionary conservative government. Establishment of a democratic people's government with the Japan Socialist Party at its head. Under such slogans, social movements gained momentum. Furthermore, under the leadership of the Japanese Communist Party, a labor movement was carried out demanding "Give us rice." At that time, Kyuichi Tokuda, a senior member of the Japanese Communist Party, went to the Prime Minister's office and staged a sit-in that lasted for more than 2 hours. In this way, citizens and political parties sympathetic to communism and socialism became more active and expressed their dissatisfaction with the government. In the midst of this, Shigeru Yoshida became prime minister. Growing public dissatisfaction forced him to temporarily abandon forming a cabinet. However, it was MacArthur that saved the situation. He issued a statement saying, "Violent demonstrations will not be tolerated." As a result, social movements that had been becoming increasingly radical gradually calmed down. Furthermore, Shigeru Yoshida requested him to provide food aid to Japan. In response, he promised food aid to Japan from the United States. Under the leadership of GHQ, emergency transportation of food was undertaken. In this way, Shigeru Yoshida managed to escape the food crisis and form a cabinet. However, the fundamental problems remained unresolved, and the first Yoshida cabinet began its term under extremely harsh conditions.
時局は誠に重大を極め、ことに食料問題の速やかなる打開は我が国民再生の鍵であり、一瞬の遷延すら許しません。
Thus, with the backing of GHQ, the first Yoshida cabinet was formed. As a result, the system of party cabinets, in which the largest party in the House of Representatives forms the cabinet, was restored to Japan. But look at the seats in the House of Representatives at that time. The Japan Liberal Party led by Yoshida did not have a majority of seats and their base in parliament was very weak. As a result, he formed an alliance with the second largest party, the Japan Progressive Party, led by Shidehara Kijiro, to form a coalition government of conservative forces. He managed to establish a system that would allow him to remain in power. However, this cabinet largely retained the personnel plans of the cabinet in which Ichiro Hatoyama was supposed to become prime minister. Therefore, whatever he did, he could not ignore the wishes of the Hatoyama faction. He often had to go to meetings and get their approval. This means that at the time he was forced to run the government without any real power base. He found it painfully clear that party politics did not allow him to get things his way. Even under these difficult circumstances, the Yoshida cabinet addressed two important issues facing Japan at the time. The first task was to formulate a constitution of Japan. Another challenge was overcoming the food crisis. Immediately after coming to power, the Yoshida cabinet's first task was to enact a constitution of Japan. Thus, the Constitution of Japan was drafted just under 6 months after Japan's defeat in the war, and promulgated 1 year and 3 months later. And it was to come into effect in just under 2 years. The Constitution of Japan is based on 3 fundamental principles: popular sovereignty, pacifism, and respect for fundamental human rights. From then on, Japan came to be run based on the Constitution of Japan. We won't go through all that right now. But let's take a quick look at what is stipulated in the Constitution of Japan, chapter by chapter. The first chapter is about the Emperor of Japan. During deliberations to amend the Constitution of the Empire of Japan, the discussion focused on whether the national polity would change. In particular, the biggest point of contention was whether sovereignty lay with the Emperor of Japan or the people. Ultimately, the preamble clearly states, "It is hereby proclaimed that sovereign power resides with the people." Furthermore, Article 1 stipulates that the Emperor of Japan's status as a symbol is based on the consensus of the Japanese people. Thus began the symbolic emperor system, with the Emperor of Japan as the symbol of the unity of Japan and its people. The imperial throne was also defined as hereditary. The Emperor of Japan was passed down from the Emperor of Japan's son to his grandson for generations. Even when the Emperor of Japan acts for the people, he must follow the opinions of the cabinet, not his own will. Furthermore, the Emperor of Japan cannot interfere in the country's politics. In this way, the Emperor of Japan's powers were restricted by the Constitution. The Prime Minister is appointed by the Emperor of Japan from among those nominated by the Diet. The Emperor of Japan cannot appoint as Prime Minister anyone not nominated by the Diet. Similarly, the Emperor of Japan appoints the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from among those nominated by the cabinet. In other words, under this system, the Emperor of Japan is not free to make these important personnel decisions. Everything is done based on the will of the people. First, the members of the Diet elected by the people nominate the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister then appoints the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In this way, political personnel decisions are decided by the will of the people. The Emperor of Japan, who is the symbol of the people, formally appoints them to their respective positions. The second chapter that follows is about the renunciation of war. This chapter has only one article. That is the famous Article 9. First, it says that the Japanese people sincerely wish for world peace. It is also declared that war and the threat or use of force as sovereign rights of the nation are forever renounced. Furthermore, it is clearly stated that the country will not possess army, navy, air force, or other military forces. It is also stipulated that a country's right to wage war does not recognize this. When it came to constitutional amendment, there was much discussion about the renunciation of war. There were also opinions that Japan should renounce war of aggression rather than war. This is because even if another country invades Japan, Japan will not be able to fight to defend itself. This is a crucial issue that concerns the survival of the nation. However, Shigeru Yoshida consistently said, "Many wars have been wars of aggression begun in the name of defense. If self-defense were allowed, it could lead to war. That is why there should be no exceptions to the renunciation of war." With this logic, he argued for not maintaining military forces. However, during deliberations in the House of Representatives, Hitoshi Ishida's proposal was accepted. The sentence "in order to achieve the purpose of the preceding paragraph" was added. This amendment allows for greater scope for interpretation of the provision. For example, let's say that the purpose of the preceding paragraph is interpreted as the renunciation of aggressive war. In that case, not possessing military forces and not renouncing the right to wage war are considered measures to avoid waging a war of aggression. It can also be interpreted as meaning that the minimum necessary military force for self-defense is not denied. Chapter 3 stipulates the rights and obligations of citizens. First of all, who is a Japanese citizen is defined by law. It also clearly states that all citizens have fundamental human rights which are permanent and inviolable. In other words, everyone is guaranteed rights simply by being human. In Chapter 3, many articles are listed to give concrete examples of fundamental human rights. Freedom of thought, religion, expression and the right to life. The right to education and basic labor rights. Thus, a wide range of rights is guaranteed. It also stipulates the duties of citizens, such as the obligation to pay taxes, work, and provide an education for their children. So far we have looked at chapters 1, 2, and 3. It is clear that each chapter reflects the three main principles of the Constitution of Japan: popular sovereignty, pacifism, and respect for fundamental human rights. From the fourth chapter onwards, there are articles that define the core parts of the country, such as the Diet, Cabinet, and Judiciary. In this case, the Judiciary refers to the courts. Each of these three branches has the legislative power to make laws, the executive power to carry out the laws, and the judicial power to adjudicate based on the laws. They have such different roles and rights. This separation of powers prevents the concentration of power in one institution and the abuse of power. For example, if the Diet enacts too many laws, the Cabinet can dissolve the House of Representatives. The courts can review laws to see if they violate the Constitution. Furthermore, if the Cabinet abuses its authority in carrying out administrative duties, the Diet can submit a motion of no confidence in the Cabinet and force the Prime Minister to resign. The courts can also hold trials to determine whether there were any problems in the administration. Conversely, if the court repeatedly makes inappropriate decisions, the Cabinet can replace the Chief Justice or judges of the Supreme Court. The Diet can establish a court to impeach judges. In this way, a system has been created in which the three institutions monitor each other, preventing the misuse of power and protecting the freedom and rights of the people. Let us now look at each of these three institutions in a little more detail. Let's start with the National Diet. The Diet is the legislative body of Japan and is responsible for making laws. The Diet consists of two houses, the House of Representatives and the House of Councilors. Members of each house are elected by the people. The term of office for members of the House of Representatives is 4 years, and the term of office for members of the House of Councilors is 6 years. However, in reality, due to the system of dissolution by the Cabinet, the term of office of House of Representatives members can be shorter than 4 years. On the other hand, the House of Councilors cannot be dissolved and half of its members are replaced every 3 years. The House of Representatives, where members change frequently, tends to better reflect the voice of the people, or public opinion. On the other hand, the House of Councilors, with its stable composition, is able to hold continuous and careful discussions. For a bill to become law, it must be passed by both houses of the Diet. If they cannot agree, a conference of both houses will be held. If they still cannot agree, the opinion of the House of Representatives takes precedence, subject to certain conditions. This is called House of Representative supremacy. The will of the House of Representatives takes precedence in important matters such as the repassing of bills, the resolution of the budget, the approval of treaties, and the nomination of the Prime Minister. Thus, the House of Representatives and the House of Councilors each have different characteristics. Laws in Japan are made with each house sharing its responsibilities. Next, let's look at the cabinet. The cabinet is the executive branch of Japan and is responsible for carrying out the laws of the country. In other words, the cabinet's job is to implement policies based on the laws and budgets established by the Diet. The cabinet consists of the Prime Minister, who is its head, and other ministers of state. And it is the Diet that selects the Prime Minister. Here too, the superiority of the House of Representatives is recognized, so the leader of the party that holds a majority in the House of Representatives usually becomes the Prime Minister. The elected Prime Minister then appoints ministers of state for each field and forms his own cabinet. In this way, the cabinet serves as the center of administration and conducts politics. Finally, let us look at the judiciary. The courts are the judicial branch of Japan and are responsible for administering justice based on the law. The Constitution of Japan stipulates that all judicial power is vested in the courts. It is an independent body, strictly separate from the executive and legislative branches. There is a Supreme Court that has jurisdiction over the entire country, and subordinate courts that are established in various regions. There are 4 types of lower courts: high courts, district courts, family courts, and summary courts. The main role of the courts is to resolve various disputes according to the law. For example, there are civil cases, which are disputes between individuals, and criminal cases, which determine whether or not criminal penalties should be imposed for criminal acts. In this way, the courts are independent of other powers and uphold social rules and justice. It plays an important role in guaranteeing the rights and freedoms of citizens. We have looked at Chapter 6 of the Constitution of Japan. Chapter 7 deals with finances. Finance is the system that determines how a country raises and spends money. First of all, the Constitution clearly states that the power to manage the nation's finances lies with the Diet. For the government to spend money on something, the cabinet must first prepare a budget. The cabinet must then submit it to the Diet for deliberation and a vote. In addition, when a country imposes a new tax or changes a tax rate, it must be backed up by law. Furthermore, when there is an unavoidable lack of money due to war or disaster, a country may raise funds by issuing government bonds, or borrowing money. In this case too, approval from the Diet is required, and the government cannot freely increase its debt. The cabinet is also required to submit a financial statement to the Diet every year. In other words, they have a responsibility to explain to the Diet and ultimately the public how they spend the money. Thus, under the Constitution of Japan, all financial activities are placed under the control of the Diet. Rules are in place to ensure that public money is spent appropriately. Chapter 8 deals with local autonomy. Local autonomy is the idea that local affairs should be decided and run by the people who live in that area. In pre-war Japan, prefectural governors and city and town mayors were appointed by the national government. Local politics was also under strong national control. In other words, there was almost no mechanism for local self-governance. However, the new constitution enacted after the war placed emphasis on extending democracy to local areas. For this reason, a system was created in which local matters are decided by local residents as much as possible. The Constitution of Japan states that the system of local autonomy shall be determined by law. Based on this, a new local autonomy law was actually enacted. Under this law, local public entity, including prefectures in cities, towns, and villages, were required to establish local assemblies to conduct their own political affairs. Governors and mayors of cities and towns would be placed there, elected by the local residents. In addition, the Home Ministry, which had authority similar to that of local government and the police, was abolished under the orders of GHQ. This was seen as an essential reform to realize local autonomy. In this way, local politics in Japan underwent a major shift from central control to self-governance led by local residents. Chapter 9 lays out the procedures for amending the Constitution. Of course, the Constitution is the fundamental rule of the country and cannot be easily changed. Therefore, there are special rules for constitutional amendment. First, a bill must be passed by a 2/3 majority in both the House of Representatives and the House of Councilors. This is much more difficult than passing a normal law by simple majority vote. Any proposed constitutional amendment passed by the Diet will then be put to a national referendum. A constitutional amendment can only become law if a majority of valid votes are in favor in this national referendum. The Constitution of Japan stipulates that the Constitution cannot be amended by the Diet alone. Ultimately, the democratic principle is that the people themselves make the decision. Under the pre-war Constitution of the Empire of Japan, the Emperor of Japan had the power to constitutional amendment. However, the Constitution of Japan clearly states that sovereignty resides with the people. Therefore, constitutional amendments are also made based on the will of the people.